Thank you very much, Simran, and good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So, if you think about corporates, who are the people leading corporates right now, whether it's the C-suite or the board? And I thought today I'm going to role play as though I am a C-suite member in a multinational company, listening to the sessions that that we listened to earlier today. How would I use those in my day job, whether it's in strategy, seeking sources of revenue, or avoiding risk management? So the role of geopolitics in that context, the ones who are by and large in the C-suite right now are the ones who grew up professionally in the 90s and the 2010s. And I have to say that for much of that period, it has been historically the most benign environment to be running businesses in. So if geopolitics is kind of the ambient backdrop, the climate, the factors you don't think of, then it really has been something that you didn't need to think about, to talk about. In fact, Professor Cox we were discussing earlier on about a range of things, and something that keeps on coming up is the role of international relations, or the IR department at LSE. And in the hierarchy of things, it's the LSE, the full name is London School of Economics and Political Science, but economics inherently has this precedence. And when I was studying economics here, I remember being very much part of that prejudice. I did some classes in politics and people studying nation states colliding like billiard balls, and I was, well, how is this at all relevant in this post-Berlin Wall era where globalization is here? End of history has happened. That happened. And I have to today very publicly apologize to everyone that I said that too, because today, right now, nation state statecraft dominates the whole of decision making amongst corporates and investors. It is not economic modeling, the stuff that I used to do, where you'd have a bunch of X variables determining Y variables, and things like geopolitics to go into the error term, the epsilon term, which was modeled to wash out in the end, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, but expected value is 0. And so you focused on the drift. And the drift at that time was convergent globalization, highly predictable in its direction of travel, with some volatility around the edges. So if I look at the timeline between the early 90s, when I said the corporate C-suite was growing up professionally, and today, stylistically I define this period, or I separate it into 3 segments. The first segment is the era of conference and convergence. So if you think about the Rio Earth Summit, or the Kyoto Summit afterwards, the WTO first ministerial meeting in the mid-50s, China's accession to the WTO in 2001, the European single currency, the euro, coming up into existence in 1999, it has been a drumbeat of convergence, by the end of which everyone would be eating Big Macs with cheese and wearing blue jeans. That was the ethos and the era. And that ended roughly around 2008, 2009. The global financial crisis was the first time when this era of convergence and conference was being questioned for the first time. And that began, in my mind, the second era, which is one of conflation and contradiction. This is when 2 things were happening at the same time. On one level, convergence was continuing, and cooperation was seen the modus operandi. Global financial crisis came about, and the solution to that was the G20, hosted by Gordon Brown here in London, 2009, and they unleashed a series of measures at the fiscal and the monetary level, at the regulatory level, convergent and coordinated around the globe, which kind of brought an end to that crisis. Or the response to the European sovereign debt crisis. Remember the Greek bonds crisis? Ultimately, the solution was ECB and the IMF working together, and they started moving along the lines of fiscal union of the European Union. So even though these fissures were emerging, the solution was seen in cooperation and coordination. But I say this was a period of conflation confusion as well, contradiction, because while in 2015 you had the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and remember the Paris Climate Agreement, two of the most converging, globalizing, agreements that you can think of. The immediate year after that, 2016, was the year of Brexit and Trump. Donald Trump. Right, a complete flip of that. And then you had the first Trump trade war number one, which by comparison today seems fairly benign, because at that time it was really about the big two, about US and China. I remember hosting an event at LSE Ideas, which was about when elephants jump, or when elephants fight, what happens to the little ones on the grasses. So for the rest of the world, it was about avoiding the tussle between those two. And certainly for Europe and the UK and Canada, that was not an issue at all, because they were very much married to the United States as the one and the same. So that was the second period, and this was also a period of quantitative easing. Global interest rates was zero practically for over a decade. European interest rates were negative. Swiss interest rates were negative. Japan was zero to negative. So it was benign monetary conditions around the globe at the same time in a synchronous manner. And now the third phase, which is where we are today, is combustion and coercion. This started at the time of COVID, when the ethos well and truly changed from one where we were all pursuing, remember I'm a corporate CEO today, right? So we were all pursuing efficiency until then. So take my supply chain wherever it needs to go, slice it up into as many segments as possible, as long as it lowers costs. Because we're talking about a borderless, frictionless world, and we can always assemble things together and bring costs down. Efficiency was the ethos at the time. That flipped to resilience during COVID. The Japanese realized that more than 90% of their PPE, the face masks, were coming from China. And for the first time, we started talking in terms of choke points, in terms of dependencies, in terms of hyper-efficiency, causing so much dependence on a few things that there was no redundancy in the system. Suddenly it was okay to introduce some redundancies, to buy some options, knowing fully well that I'm paying for these options that I hope and will probably never need to use. So they are designed redundancies built into the design, but that was okay. Then you had after COVID, you had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Another pivotal moment, because this is the first time when inflation around the globe came into the picture after having been largely absent for about a decade and a half. And US interest rates went from 0% to 5.5% in about 18 months' time. That was a dramatic change in the finances of many countries around the world. Many of the uprisings and rebellions that we had right around the world, I would draw them, the chain of causation down to that increase in funding costs that occurred in that time. Interestingly, the first time around when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, we were in the previous world, which was still contradictions, but there was still hope of convergence. We hadn't given up on the previous world order. I was an MD at UBS at the time, in charge of emerging markets, and for the first time, I had to start really, thinking about geopolitics in a way that I hadn't done before. Terrified of accidentally busting sanctions. The rule was that if you, as a bank, transacted with a Russian counterpart on any transaction that is less than 30 days, that is a foreign exchange transaction, that is not subject to sanctions. If it's more than 30 days, that is a loan, and that is subject to sanctions. And we had an IT system where you just punched in 1 month. And on some days, that's 31 days, and some other days, that's 30 days. And you could accidentally breach sanctions because of that. So, for a corporate risk management point of view, a complete nightmare. You said you work in sanctions, so I thought I would mention that. So coming to the third era that we're in right now, after the Ukraine invasion, a kinetic war being as prolonged as it is right now, then you had the dramatic re-emergence of Donald Trump, and this time round, after the discontinuation of USAID, you had the 1st of April 2025, which is Liberation Day. Reciprocal tariffs were slapped onto to the world at large. I can stop here at this point because I think that requires analysis of its own kind, but yeah, I'll stop for the moment. I think firms are still trying to find their feet. There isn't an equilibrium yet. We know the old order is gone. We are in disorder right now. The only question is whether this is going to be chaotic fragmentation or some kind of manageable volatility that we live in. You know, the classic distinction between risk versus uncertainty. There's a book by Mervyn King and John Kay, Radical Uncertainty, written just before COVID, by the way, but I think is perfectly applicable to the world we're in right now. The difference between risk and uncertainty is that in a world of risk, the broad parameters, the rules of the game are well known. So if we play football, my risk is that you kick the ball to the back of my net, and your risk is that I do the same to you. You know, this is the length of the field, that is the post, it's 90 minutes altogether, 45 minutes, half time, etc. So the rules are clear, but there's volatility within the rules. Uncertainty is where the structures are in flux, the foundations are in flux. The referee is starting to play in the middle of the game, picking up the ball up with a hand on some occasions, you know, kicking at other occasions. So that induces motion sickness of a completely different order. I remember when I was running a business in the early 2000s, strategy basically meant figuring out who is the market leader, how much market share do they have, how much market share do I have? Okay, my strategy is to halve the gap between me and them. That's it. To your question now, if we are in a world of radical uncertainty, how should companies organize themselves? They are doing exactly what you say, bringing in expertise, because there is a knowledge gap, particularly because, as I said, people like me were historically sneering at this field, not really required, to suddenly now, oh my God, where can I get people who can help me frame what's going on? So you have two levels in companies. You have the board level and you have the executive level. At the board level, they're trying to come up with a structured way to deal with this. Because still too much of the discussion about geopolitics is chit-chat. It's really journalistic. It could be this, it could be that, and how do we conceptualize it? What are the definitions? And some of them are borrowing from the world of climate change. So there was something that Mark Carney used to drive, the TCFD. How many people are familiar with TCFD? All right, so it was a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. It's a very simple framework on climate. I think we need to have a similar task force for geopolitics-related financial disclosures. You don't have to disclose it to the public. What these companies do at the board level is they have a template which says that when it comes to geopolitics, what is your governance structure? How are you determining strategy? What is your risk management framework? And what are your metrics and performance indicators? These 4 pillars. Underneath the 4 pillars, there are 11 questions. I'm not going to go into that, but you can look it up. But that is a framework they use at the board level to stay on top of where are we in terms of geopolitics and our strategy, our risk management, our governance, and our metrics. Then you come to the level of actual risk management executives, and they have their own methods. So a typical risk management framework is you start off with brainstorming what are the risk factors that affect me in my specific context as a multinational company in my sector. So that's number 1. Scope the horizon, come up with a list of risk factors, including the likelihood, your subjective probability of each of these materializing. Number 2, you try and assess what is your exposure to each of these risk factors. Not every company will have the same exposure to the same risks. So, you know, people ask me now, what's going on? What's the next flashpoint, right? Is it Cuba? What is your exposure to each of the risk factors is number 2. Number 3, what is your risk appetite? So having determined that this is how much you're exposed to each of these risk factors, then you ask yourself, can I live with it? If I cannot live with it, can I eliminate it or can I mitigate it? What is my hedging strategy? And then finally, you go through a range of scenarios. This is literally fiction writing, imagineering. You're writing fictions about scenarios. What happens if these things happen? And then more importantly, what is the sequence of decision making that will follow the initial risk event that could either amplify or mitigate the risk that I'm subject to? So that is the kind of framework that you would use to then model geopolitics. Finally, when it comes to strategy, you look for, okay, how do I strategize now? Risk is one thing, but how do I be on the front foot, and how do I decide where the opportunities will be? They're relying on models from academia, from IR departments, from in the world, my world in economics, you have Matteo Maggiore. I don't know if you've read, any of you have read Matteo Maggiore? He has a framework on choke points. If you have a hegemon who used to provide public goods, suddenly discovering that they have asymmetric power over you, and they control choke points, and there's some very clear definitions on what is a choke point and what's not. How do you then model the next few steps of that relationship? It's a great framework that I really like. Danny Quah, how many of you know Danny Quah?
No.
He was here, right? So Danny has another framework which is based on demand and supply of global order. Who is supplying global order? Where is the demand coming from? If it's a market, then who is the price taker and who is the price setter? So you've got that framework. There's a model that I'm trying to develop now from the world of finance, which is options pricing. If I look at the valuation of options, what do people do to hedge themselves? Is it a one-shot hedge, or is it dynamic adjustments along the way? The value of time. I knew that in that moment, they held all the cards, but you need to buy time. And over time, you need to then reposition yourselves. That's what the Europeans need to do with respect to the US, thinking back about the first panel, for example. So those models are out there, you bring them all into your firm. So this is an evolving space. Yes, so the short answer is yes. Firstly, emerging markets are interesting because purely from an economics lens, they have growth potential. They have good fundamentals, as we like to say, in a relatively young population, underdeveloped infrastructure. So with a bit of good governance, you can really convert that into a growth opportunity, as opposed to a country that has a demographic downdraft. They're at the frontier of cutting edge innovation. For them, they're lucky if they can get 2% growth, but emerging markets, you can get 6, 7, 8% growth. So it makes sense from an economics point of view. The challenge has always been the quality of local governance. And now, in terms of the topic of our discussion, the question is, where do they fit into the new global disorder? Who is a middle power? Is it a middle-sized country? Or is it a different concept? A middle power is probably one that has a level of influence that is more than a small country. But you have small countries like Singapore that is a middle power because they have influence in other areas. So where do they fit in that is important. I think one of the casualties of today's era, whether you call it Trump 2.0 or arguably a post-multilateral world, is that when multilateral institutions get degraded, small countries don't know where to go to have discussions. Where can I convene? Because if I turn up at the UN General Assembly, it turns out that those who I want to meet with are not there because they have their own little, club, and so it's important to find those places where you can go. To that extent, if I give you a little anecdote, so Singapore is very good at convening outside of these formal structures. So they had formed something, I wasn't aware of this last year, that they call FITP, F-I-T-P. It's Future of Investment and Trade Partnership. I was visiting Singapore at the time of the Bloomberg Summit, and the night before, from my hotel room, I was on WebEx, and we were negotiating with USTR on Bangladesh. And my colleagues from Bangladesh had joined in, and one of them mentioned to USTR, hey, we saw that you made this concession to Guatemala and to Switzerland. Is that available to us? And they said, no, don't believe everything you read. No, let's move on. So we moved on. The next day, I find out about this FITB thing happening. Bangladesh is not a member, but because I was there, they let me be there at the table. And to my right was Switzerland, and my left was Guatemala. So we could have a quick huddle and talk about, how's it going. Same in Davos. I could have a huddle with the Korean trade minister or the Vietnamese. And so these informal gatherings have become a lot more important now, because otherwise, structurally, some of these emerging markets they don't have a seat at the table anymore. And so we need to create more tables. But by and large, companies are now having to, first question they have to ask is, what is the geopolitics around this decision that I'm about to take? Whereas in the past it was, this makes sense economically, I'm going to make sure that politics follows me, other way around. Now in terms of how to navigate it, or the role of the private sector. So acknowledge that the game has now changed. This is now going to be led by nation state, statecraft players in the public sector, and there is a deficiency of expertise. They need to strike agreements between themselves, but very few civil service servants around the world have that expertise. The UK did a great job, and I know LSE Ideas played a role in making sure that UK developed trade negotiation capabilities very quickly after Brexit, which is an exception, not the rule. And so you need that capacity a lot more in the public sectors, and the private sector can help with that. But otherwise, the private sector is having to navigate. And if I could just give you two very quick examples. One, in the first trade war, the first Trump administration trade war, when the focus was on China. Remember, the tariffs were on Chinese exports. You had something that we were calling Vietnam washing at the time. And so what that meant was you just uproot the factory, put it in Vietnam, and put a made in Vietnam label on it, and that was being used to divert. That clearly is not happening anymore, because in the next round of negotiations, transshipment through a third country is being. I don't know if any of you watched the congressional hearing or grilling of the CEO of TikTok. Remember that? And the CEO kept on saying, "Senator, I'm a Singaporean." And they kept on saying, "Are you a member of the Chinese Communist Party?" "No, Senator, I served in the army of my country, I'm a Singaporean." So, "Have you ever been a member of the Chinese Communist Party?" That exchange between Senator Tom Cotton and Mr. Shou, the CEO of TikTok, I think was a great dramatized example. But the other was a couple of months ago. A AI company called Manus, M-A-N-U-S, based in Singapore, was bought by Facebook for $2 billion. It was announced in December of last year. So Facebook decided to acquire a Singaporean company. Let's do that, no problem. On the 26th of May, a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese have now said, hang on, that is really a Chinese company. The technology behind it, the AI, is Chinese technology. This is critical. This is against our national interest. So we do not approve, and we want you to unwind it. So this is not stopping it before the acquisition. This is afterwards. It's happening right now as we speak. So Iran and Hormuz that we just spoke about. Americans slapped on sanctions on entities, including, I believe, some Chinese oil refineries that are receiving Iranian oil and refining them. So those companies are named as sanctioned names by the US. So if you're a bank, HSBC, Standard Chartered, and if you're lending to these companies, you could be subject to punitive measures because you're busting US sanctions. What did the Chinese do? They said, well, hang on, we object to that. We believe those sanctions are extraterritorial. Any bank that complies with that cannot do business in my country. What do you do then? Right, so damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Insights from the public sector to the private sector.
Public to the private sector. Oh yeah, lots. Why is the reform process a journey as opposed to a binary switch? So I have a lot more sympathy now for the political economy and the execution challenges in the public sector. So what I would say to the old me in the private sector is to try and figure out what the political economy considerations are, because it's easy to figure out what needs to be done. It is much harder to figure out why is it that what needs to be done does not get done? It's not because people are stupid, because there is a sequencing and pacing, and there are vested interests and all of those things. Again, all of the stuff that as economists we used to assume away, they were not in the model. I'm beginning to realize that is the model. That should take the central centerpiece. The world, the definition of global has changed. So in my career, I've had a global title twice. Once when I was based in London, and I was global head of a small business, having never worked outside of London. But it didn't really matter, because we were in that convergent globalizing world where everything was coming to me, and every office in the world was going to look exactly like mine. So local context didn't matter at all. In the latter part of my career, I was global head again, this time an emerging markets business, and all of a sudden, idiosyncrasies are everything. No two countries were the same. Today, that should be the dominant lens. There is no such thing as top-down global anymore. Anyone who says global, every other sentence, I get really skeptical about their frame worldview. I think we need to aggregate up to global by really appreciating the local context. Geopolitics is really locally felt, and then nationally, and then regionally, and then you aggregate up to global. You start with global, that is not going to work. So that is something I would really impress upon corporates, particularly those who are based in the Western capital. If you have hegemons, and let's assume we have two hegemons now with the US and China, for a third country, it is not an optimum solution to align 100% with one or the other. It is optimum to try and create a degree of strategic autonomy, while at the same time benefit from, as you mentioned, the investments and everything else that you can. And the other side also know that, and they have asymmetric power in many cases, and they will try a combination of coercion and seduction. And the third countries will have to then find their own place. So I think it is not a binary world where it's one or the other. They would like you to believe that is, but statecraft is now really much more about that. And then what coalitions are formed by the others in a kind of G-2 world? How are the others looking at the world? The EU, India free trade agreement, for example. They've been working on a free trade agreement for, I'm told, 16 years. And then once reciprocal tariffs came about, they got it done in 6 months. Bangladesh had never done a free trade agreement with anyone. We got it done in 1 year with Japan. The linkages that are taking place outside of the two big ones, I think are very important. It's not just a Trump thing. So it was actually Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, remember that? That was taking business out of Europe, and Macron complained at the time that, hey, what's going on? It was actually Biden that said to the Dutch company ASML that we would like you not to export to China, because this is critical technology in the semiconductor space. But of course, there is a difference, or maybe the only difference between previous administration and Trump is in the degree of drama, but not in the direction, broadly speaking. So this is ally on ally. From the rest of the world, it really looks like you had a partnership, you had a marriage of sorts, and the US has friend-zoned the EU, maybe ghosted them. Doesn't mean we're your rival, we're your enemies, but you've been friend-zoned all of a sudden, and you were dependent, emotionally dependent on your partner, and now you don't really know how to go about it. And in that time, China's exports to the rest of the world and China's surplus to the rest of the world is now at a record high.
Reflection on the past.
Thank you. And just if I could add one point to that, it's I hear about the Mark Carney speech a lot.
Yes.
Everyone talks about that.
Yeah.
There were other speeches too.
There were.
And happened. But in terms of speeches, I would also encourage you to look up the speech last week by the Vietnamese president at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. And he expands on their concept of bamboo diplomacy. I think it's a great framing of how third countries, whether you're in the global south or in the north, need to adjust.